The grandfather clock in the hallway struck the hour, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound. I'm Silas Vance, and for 4 years, I've lived in a house where the air is as still as a tomb. At 70, sleep is a fickle friend, often leaving me alone with my thoughts in the middle of the night. Tonight was different. A strange, biting chill filled my bedroom, a cold so sharp it felt like winter had moved indoors, despite the mild June air outside. My breath hitched in a tiny cloud of mist as I sat up. The shadows in the corners of my small carriage house seemed to stretch and pulse, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. On the desk across the room, a blue light flickered. It was Thomas's old laptop, a machine that hadn't been powered on since the day we buried him. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I crossed the room, my bare feet silent on the hardwood, and stared at the screen. A notification glowed against the dark background. Cloud storage update, one new audio file received. The timestamp was 30:47 a.m., exactly the time the police said Thomas's car crashed into the lake. My hands shook as I reached for the mouse. The cursor lagged as if fighting an invisible force. I clicked the play button now. Static filled the room first, a white noise that sounded like rushing water. Then, a voice broke through. Dad, if you're hearing this, I'm already gone. They're going to call it an accident. Don't believe them. I know the truth now. And they know I know. It's the Sterling Bribes' dad. They're killing people for profit. Thomas's voice was strained, the familiar warmth replaced by a raw, jagged edge of terror. They found out I have the ledger. I hid everything at the fishing cabin. Look under the floorboards near the fireplace. You have to be careful. They are watching everyone. Please, Dad. Don't let them get away with it. You always taught me that justice has to mean something. Keep yourself safe. I'm so sorry I left you all alone with these monsters in the dark. Do this for me, for the truth, and for our family name. The audio cut out with a sharp click that sounded like a bone snapping. The laptop screen went black, and suddenly, the freezing cold vanished. I stood there in the dark, my mind racing. He hadn't just died. He'd been hunted down. And the people who had hugged me at his funeral, the people who had offered me this charming carriage house to keep me close, were the ones holding the hounds. I had to find those old boards before morning came. I spent the rest of the night sitting in that chair, watching the shadows retreat. The voice of my son, so clear and yet so far away, echoed in my mind. He believed in the world even when the world didn't believe in him. Now, his words were the only thing keeping me upright. Welcome to FamiliX Revenge. If you believe justice has no expiration date, subscribe and tell me sin. Would you open that floorboard? By 8 o'clock, I was standing in the kitchen of the main house. The Sterlings lived in a world of marble and silver, a place where even the air felt expensive. Julianne was already at the table, a vision of high society grace in her silk robe. She was sipping from a white porcelain mug embossed with the Sterling Pharma logo, a stylized golden leaf that looked more like a claw. She looked like the grieving fiancée everyone expected her to be. But today, I saw the cracks in the porcelain. The way she held her cup was too rigid. Silas, you look tired, Julianne said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that now tasted like copper. Did you have another restless night? You know, the doctor said these hallucinations of cold rooms are common at your age. I forced a smile, the kind of expression I'd worn for 4 long years. Just the usual, Julianne. Perhaps the carriage house is just showing its age. Raid walked in then, his presence filling the room like a heavy cloud. He was younger than me, built like a man who spent his time at expensive gyms and on shady backroom deals. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he reached for a Sterling Pharma travel tumbler and poured himself a coffee, his eyes scanning the morning paper with a bored indifference. He looked at a headline about a local medical clinic closure, a clinic his company had likely strangled, without a hint of guilt. You're 70, Silas, Raid muttered without looking up. The cold is in your bones, not the thermostat. Maybe it's time we finally talked about that assisted living community in the valley again. You're getting frail. I saw your hands shaking while you were pruning the roses yesterday. It's not safe for you to be out there alone anymore. Besides, We're converting the carriage house into a private gym next month. We've already moved Thomas's old boxes to the attic. No point in living in a museum, right? The arrogance in his voice was a physical weight. He had spent the last 4 years systematically erasing every trace of my son. The photos on the mantel had been replaced by corporate awards. Thomas's study was now a storage room for Julianne's gala dresses. Now, they wanted to erase me, too. In his world, people like me, retired librarians with a sense of duty, were obstacles to be managed or deleted. The Sterlings were old money, a phrase they used to justify every selfish choice. They believed their wealth made them untouchable. I'm quite fine where I am. Raid, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the roar in my ears. The carriage house is a part of Thomas's legacy. I'm not ready to walk away from that yet. It's the only place that still feels like home to me. Julianne reached across the table and patted my hand. Her skin was ice cold. Of course not, dear. Raid is just worried. We both are. We lost Thomas, and we don't want to lose you too. You're the last connection we have to him, and we take our responsibilities to our loved ones very seriously. That's why we're planning a special tribute at the charity gala tomorrow. The Thomas Vance Memorial Wing. It'll look great for the merger announcement. It was a lie so practiced it almost sounded like the truth. For years, I had let this woman comfort me. I had sat at this very table and thanked her for her kindness while she used my son's name to polish her company's image. They thought I was a senile old man they could control with a few soft words and a place to sleep. They didn't realize that the librarian they mocked had spent his life finding patterns where others saw chaos. I knew how to read between the lines, and the lines here were written in blood and greed. The brand, I whispered, staring at the Sterling Pharma logo on the napkin. To them, my son's life was just a line item in a marketing report. The Sterling's wealth didn't just feel old, it felt heavy, like the air in a tomb. They prioritized acquisition over humanity. Thomas discovered their pharmaceutical bribes, how they rerouted failed batches of heart medication to low-income clinics to keep their profit margins high. He called it inventory optimization. I called it mass murder. This mansion, this marble, the very silk Julianne wore. It was all paid for by families who were currently mourning loved ones who had taken sterling medicine. I excused myself after breakfast, claiming I needed some fresh air. I walked toward the edge of the property, near the tall wrought iron gates. That was when I saw him. A young man was standing across the street, leaning against a rusted sedan. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work boots, looking completely out of place in this neighborhood of mansions. But it wasn't his clothes that caught my breath. It was his face. The jawline was sharp, the eyes a deep, intelligent blue. He had the same stubborn set to his shoulders that Thomas always had. It was like looking at a ghost from 20 years ago. He caught me staring, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a shared pain that didn't need words. But then a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Reed had returned. The young man vanished into the trees like he'd never been there. I returned to my room, my hands finally steady. I remembered a name from Thomas's old emails, someone he'd mentioned in passing years ago, Rebecca, and a son he never got to meet. That evening, Julianne brought tea to the carriage house, her eyes searching the room for any sign that I was digging. Don't make things difficult, Silas, she warned, her voice dropping the honeyed tone. We've been very patient with you. But the merger goes through in 24 hours. Once the papers are signed, the Sterling name will be part of a global conglomerate. We won't have room for unstable relatives causing scenes. Enjoy your tea. She left the door clicking shut with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. They were moving fast. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were clearing the decks for their biggest payday yet. The Sterlings killed my son for profit, and now they were using his memorial to seal the deal. I waited for darkness to settle over the estate. I grabbed my heavy bag and the keys to my old truck. The senile old man was finished being a prisoner. I was going to the cabin, and I was going to bring back the ghosts they thought they'd drowned. The road to the fishing cabin was a winding ribbon of cracked asphalt that looked like a scar on the side of the mountain. It had been 4 years since I last made this trip. Back then, I was a man blinded by grief, coming here to pack up the remnants of a life that had been cut short. Tonight, I was a hunter. My old truck groaned as it climbed the steep incline, the engine sounding like a tired heart. The rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets, blurring the world outside my windshield until everything was just a smear of gray and green. I didn't care. The voice on the laptop was still ringing in my ears, a ghost song that wouldn't let me rest. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The Sterlings thought they had won. They thought they had buried the truth in the same cold water where my son took his last breath. But the truth is a stubborn thing. It doesn't stay submerged forever. Eventually, the tide turns, and everything hidden is cast back onto the shore. The cabin sat nestled in a grove of pines that seemed to huddle together against the storm. It was a small, rugged structure made of cedar logs that had silvered with age. As I stepped out of the truck, the smell of wet earth and pine needles rushed to meet me. It was a scent that used to mean peace, but now it felt like a warning. I pulled my heavy flashlight from the glove box and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the front door. The lock was rusted, but my old key still turned with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air was stagnant and thick with the smell of old wood and dust. My flashlight beam danced over the furniture, a moth-eaten sofa, a small wooden table where we used to play cards, and the stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. Everything was covered in a thin, gray shroud of dust. It was a museum of a life I thought I knew. I moved toward the fireplace, my heart hammering against my ribs. Thomas's voice told me to look under the floorboards nearby. I knelt on the cold stone, my 70-year-old knees protesting the movement. "I'm here, son," I whispered into the empty room. "I'm looking for the truth." I started tapping the wooden planks with the handle of my flashlight. Hollow, solid, solid, hollow. Near the edge of the hearth, the sound changed. It was a deep, empty thud that made my skin prickle. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small pry bar I'd brought from the carriage house. I wedged the metal tip into the gap between the boards and pushed. The wood screamed as the old nails gave way. I pulled the first plank up, then the second. Beneath the boards, resting in the dirt and cobwebs, was a heavy canvas bag. I hauled it out, my muscles straining. But as I moved the bag, my flashlight beam caught something else tucked further back into the shadows. I reached in and pulled out a small object, wrapped in a piece of soft flannel. I unwrapped it, and my breath hitched. It was a wood carving, a small, half-finished owl. I remembered Thomas telling me he was working on something special for my 70th birthday. He had barely started the feathers on the wings. The wood was smooth, smelling faintly of cedar, and the oil he used to keep his tools sharp. Holding it felt like holding his hand. It wasn't just evidence I was finding. It was the stolen moments of a life that had been cut short by people who only valued what could be traded on an exchange. I tucked the carving into my inner jacket pocket, right against my heart, and turned my attention to the bag. Inside wasn't just a box of papers. The first thing I saw was an oxygen tank, the same one the police said Thomas was using when he went down in the lake. It was a standard piece of diving equipment, but something was wrong. I leaned closer, my flashlight highlighting the regulator. It had been filed down with surgical precision. A small, calculated notch had been cut into the valve, ensuring that once it reached a certain depth, the pressure would cause it to fail. It wasn't an accident. It was a mechanical execution designed to look like a tragedy. "You monsters," I hissed. My voice sounded thin and brittle in the quiet cabin. I reached deeper into the bag and pulled out a leather-bound book. It was Thomas's private journal, the one he never let me see. I sat on the floor, ignoring the dampness of the wood, and began to read. The handwriting was frantic. The ink smudged in places as if he had been writing in a hurry. March 12th. I read aloud, my voice trembling. "Red thinks I'm not paying attention to the logistics reports. He thinks I'm just the fiance's favorite, who got a job out of pity. But I've seen the shipping manifests. The Sterling family isn't just selling medicine, they're selling poison. The lot numbers for the low-income clinics don't match the quality control signatures. They're taking the batches that failed the purity tests and rerouting them to avoid a total loss. They're balancing their books with the lives of people who can't afford to sue them. They call it inventory optimization, but I call it murder. I found a spreadsheet titled Sterling Bribes. It lists payments to inspectors and politicians to look the other way while these tainted shipments go out. One official, a man named Henderson, received $50,000 just last week. It's all right here. I even found a note from Julianne to read saying, "The liability is high, but the margins are higher. Just keep Thomas in the dark until the wedding is over." I turned the page, my eyes blurring with tears. The depth of the corruption was staggering. It wasn't just one bad batch, it was a years-long operation of corporate greed. April 4th. I confronted Julianne today. I thought she didn't know. I thought she was a victim of her brother's greed, but she looked me right in the eye and told me to grow up. She said the world is built on compromises, and that the Sterling legacy is worth more than a few unfortunate statistics. She actually called them statistics. I saw the ice in her then. It wasn't just business for her. It was a birthright. She told me if I went to the authorities, nobody would believe a librarian's son over a Sterling. She threatened my father. She said if I spoke up, they'd make sure Silas lost everything. I can't let that happen. But I can't stay silent either. If I don't act, how many more people will get sick because of a Sterling pill? I have to gather enough evidence to make the case undeniable. I've started copying the server files to a secure drive. I'll take them to Alina Vance. She's the only one who can help me blow the whistle without the Sterling lawyers burying me first. The journal continued for pages, detailing names of corrupt officials and the specific banks where the Sterling bribes were deposited. It was a map of a criminal empire. Thomas had been building a dead man's switch, a collection of evidence that would trigger if he disappeared. He'd hidden it here, in the one place he thought was safe from their prying eyes. I read about his plan to meet a journalist named Elena Vance. No relation, just a coincidence he'd joked about, and how he was going to hand over the ledger at the town library. The last entry was dated May 14th, the day of his death. "I'm going to the lake today. Raid insisted we go diving to clear the air before the wedding. He's acting like everything is fine, but he's too friendly. He bought me a new tank as an early wedding gift. I don't trust it. I've checked the regulator, but I can't find the flaw yet. If I don't come back, Dad, look for this book. I love you. Please finish what I started." I closed the journal and held it against my chest. The weight of it felt like a physical connection to my son's final moments. He knew. He went into that water knowing his life was at risk, all to protect me and to stop the Sterlings from hurting anyone else. My grief, which had been a dull ache for 4 years, sharpened into something cold and hard. It was no longer just about losing a son, it was about the absolute betrayal of a man's goodness by people who didn't have a soul between them. The Sterlings had played the part of the grieving family perfectly. They had held my hand at the memorial service, while Thomas's lungs were still full of lake water. They'd ensured he couldn't breathe. They had offered me a place to live to keep me close, to make sure I never started asking the wrong questions. They hadn't been helping me. They'd been guarding me like a prisoner in a golden cage. I was a loose end they were waiting to tie off. I looked around the cabin again. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me. Every creak of the floorboards now sounded like a footstep. I wasn't alone in this mystery anymore. I had the evidence, but I was a 70-year-old man in a remote cabin with a tampered oxygen tank and a book that could bring down a multi-million-dollar empire. I needed to get back to the truck. I needed to find Alina Vance. I needed to make sure Thomas's voice was finally heard. As I stood up, the light of my flashlight caught something through the window. 2 pinpricks of light in the distance. A car was coming up the mountain road. Panic flared in my chest. Nobody came up here at this hour. The Sterlings must have realized I was gone. Maybe they had a tracker on my truck. Maybe they'd been watching the carriage house more closely than I thought. I didn't have time to hide the floorboards properly. I grabbed the bag and scrambled toward the back door, the one that led into the dense woods behind the cabin. I slipped out into the rain, the cold water instantly soaking through my jacket. I didn't head for my truck. If they saw it there, they'd know I was nearby. I ducked behind a large oak tree and waited. The car pulled into the clearing, its headlights cutting through the mist. It was a black SUV, the same one I'd seen in the driveway earlier. Reed stepped out. He didn't look like the bored businessman from breakfast. He looked focused. He looked dangerous. He had a heavy-duty flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. He wasn't here to talk. "I'm at the cabin," Reed said, his voice carrying over the sound of the rain as he spoke into a cell phone. "The old man's truck is here. He's inside. I told you we should have moved him months ago, Julianne. He's starting to dig. I don't care how it looks. If he found anything, he's not leaving this mountain. We can't afford another loose end. Not now, with the merger so close. Just stay at the house and act surprised when the call comes." I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I watched him walk toward the front door. He was going to finish what he started 4 years ago. I had to move. I had to get to the main road before he realized I wasn't inside. I began to crawl through the underbrush, the thorns tearing at my skin. I didn't feel the pain. All I felt was the weight of the journal against my side. Thomas had died to bring this truth to light. I wouldn't let him down. I reached the tree line and began a slow trek down the side of the ridge. I knew these woods better than Raid did. I had spent years hiking these trails with Thomas. Every rock and every stream was a memory. I used those memories now to guide me through the dark. I was tired, wet, and terrified. I had the map to justice in my hands. The Sterling Empire was built on lies, and I was finally going to burn it down. I pressed my face against the cold, damp earth beneath the floorboards of the storage shed at the base of the mountain. My heart hammering so loudly I was certain Raid would hear it through the wood if he followed me. The space was tight, smelling of old decay and wet rot. Above me, the forest floor groaned under the weight of the storm. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the rain to mask my presence. I clutched Thomas's journal and that small wood carving to my chest. This book was my shield, but in this moment, it felt more like a target. I waited until the sound of the SUV's engine faded into the distance, heading toward the ridge where I had supposedly fled. I didn't move for a long time. I counted to 300, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Finally, I pushed my way out. I didn't look back. I didn't go for my truck. I knew Raid would be watching the road. Instead, I headed deeper into the pines, moving toward the old logging trail that led to the public library where I'd worked for 40 years. It was a 5-mile trek through the mud, but it was the only place I knew where I could disappear. By the time I reached the library's back entrance, the sun was beginning to peek through the gray clouds. My body ached with a fatigue I hadn't felt in decades. I used my old staff key to slip inside. The smell of paper and glue was the first thing that had felt like home in years. I headed for the basement archives, a place where the Sterling influence couldn't reach. I needed a phone, and I needed a witness. "You're late," a voice whispered from the shadows of the tall shelves. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Standing by the microfiche machine was the young man from the street. In the harsh fluorescent light of the basement, the resemblance to Thomas was even more startling. He had the same cowlick in his hair, the same way of standing with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking. "And why do you have my son's face?" The boy stepped forward, his expression a mix of defiance and sorrow. "My name is Caleb. My mother was Rebecca Miller. She worked at the Sterling plant 10 years ago, before they downsized her department. Thomas didn't even know she was pregnant when he started dating Julianne. He thought Rebecca moved away to start a new life, but she didn't move because she wanted to. Julianne paid for her silence. She told my mom that if she ever contacted Thomas, the Sterlings would make sure neither of us ever found work again. She gave my mom a choice: take the money and disappear, or stay and watch her son grow up in a trailer with nothing. I sank into a nearby chair, the weight of his words hitting me harder than the cold mountain rain. Thomas had a son. I had a grandson. For 10 years, I had been mourning a branch of my family tree that I didn't even know existed, all while Julianne smiled at me and called me family. Thomas found out. Caleb continued, his voice trembling. A few months before the accident, he tracked us down. He came to see me at my school. He told me he was going to make things right. He said he was uncovering something big at the company, something that would give him the leverage to break away from the Sterlings without them hurting us. He promised he'd take me fishing at that old cabin once everything was settled. He never got the chance, I whispered. No, Caleb said, his eyes hardening. Because he found out about the bribes. He found out they weren't just greedy, they were criminals. My mom died last year from the same lung infection that's been hitting the east side of town. The medicine the Sterlings provided for the free clinic, it didn't work, Silas. It was nothing but chalk and fillers. They took the government subsidies for the good stuff and sold the inventory optimization batches to the poor. My mom died because of the family you've been living with. She suffocated while Julianne was buying a new yacht. The social issue of pharmaceutical inequality wasn't just a headline anymore. It was sitting right in front of me, wearing a flannel shirt and grieving a mother who had been silenced by sterling gold. I reached into my bag and pulled out the journal and the half-finished owl carving. I handed the carving to him. He was working on this for me, but I think he'd want you to have a piece of him. Caleb's fingers brushed the cedar wood, and for a second, the hardness in his eyes softened. He was a good man, Silas. I only saw him twice, but he was a good man. We're going to prove that to the world, I said. For the next 3 hours, we sat in the quiet basement and connected the dots. I used my archival skills to pull up old property records and corporate filings. We found that sterling bribes were even more extensive than Thomas had realized. They weren't just bribing local inspectors. They were funding the campaigns of the state representatives who oversaw the health board. It was a closed loop of corruption. The Sterlings provided the money, the politicians provided the protection, and the public provided the bodies. Look at this, I said, pointing to a line in the ledger Thomas had copied. A $50,000 payment to a firm called Vanguard Security. That's Reed's private firm. They weren't just doing security. They were the ones handling the disposal of complaints. Every time a doctor at the clinic tried to report the ineffective medicine, Reed's men would show up and negotiate a settlement. Usually, it involved a non-disclosure agreement and a heavy dose of intimidation. That's what they did to my mom, Caleb muttered. They told her she was crazy. They told her the medicine was fine, and that she was just a bad mother for not being able to save her own health. They broke her spirit before they ever broke her body. They called her a statistic. We can't just go to the police, Caleb said, looking at the door as if he expected Raid to burst through at any moment. If Raid has the sheriff in his pocket like you heard at the cabin, they'll just take the journal and burn it. We'll be disappeared before the first headline hits the paper. You're right, I agreed. We need someone they can't touch. We need a voice that's louder than their money. Thomas mentioned a journalist in his note. Elena Vance. She's an investigative reporter for the state's largest paper. She's been trying to crack the Sterling case for years, but she never had an insider. She never had the physical evidence. I picked up the library's desk phone and dialed the number I had memorized from Thomas's notes. My heart was pounding, but my hand was steady. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't feel like a frail old man waiting for the end. I felt like a librarian with a very overdue book to return. Elena Vance, I said when the voice answered on the third ring. My name is Silas Vance. My son was Thomas Vance. I have his journal, a tampered oxygen tank, and a witness who can prove the Sterlings are killing people for profit. Do you want the story of the century, or should I call the feds? There was a long pause on the other end. I've been waiting for this call for 4 years. Silas, where are you? The downtown library, basement archives, and Alina. Bring a camera. We're going to need to record everything before the Sterlings realize the loose end has finally started to fray their whole tapestry. I hung up the phone and looked at Caleb. He looked frightened, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was my grandson. He was the future that Thomas had died to protect. What do we do now? Caleb asked. Now, I said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward me. We make a list. Every name, every date, every bribe. We're going to build a cage so small that Julianne and Reed won't be able to breathe inside it. They thought I was a senile old man they could tuck away in a carriage house. They forgot that I've spent my life keeping records. And today, the record is finally going to be set straight. We spent the rest of the morning working. We cross-referenced the journal entries with public records, finding the exact dates when the tainted shipments were sent out and matching them with the spikes in respiratory illnesses at the East Side Clinic. Every piece of evidence we found was a nail in the Sterling's coffin. It was a meticulous, exhausting process, but with every document we saved, the weight on my chest grew lighter. Do you think people will actually care? Caleb asked as we watched the printer hum, spitting out copies of the bribe ledger. I mean, the Sterlings are practically royalty here. They donate to the opera. They have their names on the hospital wing. That's exactly why people will care, I replied. Because when the people realize that the hospital wing was paid for by the lives of the people who died in the basement of the clinic, they won't just be angry. They'll be hungry for justice. The Sterlings didn't give that money away out of the goodness of their hearts, Caleb. They gave it away to buy a reputation that would protect them from the truth. But reputations are made of paper, and paper burns. I looked at Caleb, and for a moment I saw Thomas smiling back at me. We weren't just seeking revenge, we were seeking restoration. I'm scared, Grandpa, Caleb whispered. It was the first time he had called me that. The word felt like a warm light in a dark room. I am too, son, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. But being scared just means you're about to do something brave. And we're doing this together. For Thomas, for your mother, and for everyone who ever suffered while a Sterling got rich. The basement door creaked open. I stood up, shielding Caleb behind me. But it wasn't Raid. It was a woman with a sharp bob and a camera bag slung over her shoulder. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the piles of documents and the young man who looked like a ghost. I'm Elena, she said, her voice steady and professional. Show me what you've got. I stepped aside, revealing the journal and the tampered tank. The Sterlings call this inventory optimization, I said. I call it a confession. Where do you want to start? The basement of the library was usually a place of quiet reflection, but tonight it was a war room. Tables that used to hold children's books were now covered in maps, corporate charts, and printed bank statements. Elena Vance sat behind her camera, her face lit by the glow of 3 different laptop screens. Caleb was pacing the narrow aisles between the bookshelves, his young face tight with a mix of anger and adrenaline. I sat at the center of it all, my old librarian's hands sorting through the physical evidence. The Sterlings had spent millions trying to delete their digital footprints, but they had forgotten about the permanence of paper. In the deep archives, I had found the original property deeds for the Vanguard Security shell company. It was the missing link that proved Raid wasn't just Julianne's brother. He was the enforcer for their entire criminal enterprise. Look at this, I said, sliding a grainy photocopy across to Elena. This deed proves Raid bought the warehouse where the tainted medicine was stored. He used a fake name, but he used the Sterling family's primary attorney to file the paperwork. They were so arrogant, they didn't even think to change their legal counsel. Elena zoomed her lens in on the document, her expression darkening. This is the smoking gun, Silas. It ties the physical location of the poison directly to the family office. But we have a major problem. I just got word from my contact at the Capitol. The merger papers are scheduled to be signed at midnight tomorrow. Once that happens, Sterling Pharma becomes a subsidiary of a global conglomerate. Their legal shield will be impenetrable. They'll have enough lobbyists and lawyers to bury this for a century. Then we have exactly 16 hours. I said, the ticking of the wall clock now sounding like a countdown. The charity gala, Caleb interrupted, stopping his pacing. It's tomorrow night. The Sterling Foundation for Global Health is celebrating its 10th anniversary at the Grand Hotel. Everyone who matters will be there. The mayor, the governor, the press. It's the one night of the year when they can't hide behind their gates. And it's our only window before that midnight deadline. I looked at the invitation I had taken from the Sterling mansion. It was a thick, cream-colored card with gold leaf lettering. It promised a night of visionary healing and compassionate leadership. The irony was like a physical weight in my chest. They were going to stand on a stage and accept awards for their generosity, while the people they had poisoned were still struggling to breathe in the East Side clinics. They were going to use the blood money from those tainted batches to buy more influence and more silence. My fingers brushed the gold edges of the card. I knew exactly what we had to do. We aren't going to just crash the party. I said, my voice low and steady. We're going to let them start the show. We're going to let them tell their lies to the world. And then, we're going to give the audience the truth they weren't invited to see. Elena, can you get into their video system? Alina nodded, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. The hotel uses a standard wireless network for their presentation slides. If I can get into the ballroom with my laptop, I can override their feed. I can play whatever we want on those massive screens behind the podium. And what exactly are we playing? Caleb asked. A confession, I replied. And a message from a father who has finally stopped crying and started fighting. I spent the next hour writing. I didn't need to look at Thomas's journal anymore. I had memorized every word of his pain. I wanted the world to see the faces of the people the Sterlings had called unfortunate statistics. I wanted the donors to see the medical reports Caleb had brought from the clinic. Most of all, I wanted them to hear my son's voice. I had Alina set up a single spotlight in the corner of the archives. I sat in a simple wooden chair, the same kind Thomas used to sit in when he'd visit me at work. Start the recording, I told her. The red light on the camera flickered to life. I looked directly into the lens, imagining I was looking Julianne and Reid right in their cold, calculating eyes. My name is Silas Vance. I began, my voice clear and unwavering. For 4 years I was a man who lived in the dark. I believed the lies told to me by people I thought were my family. I believed that my son Thomas died in a tragic accident. But the truth doesn't drown. It just waits for the ice to melt. Tonight, you are going to see the evidence of a corporate crime that spans a decade. You are going to see how the sterling fortune was built on the backs of the sick and the voices of the silenced. But first, I have a message for my son. I took a deep breath, the air in the basement feeling suddenly warm. Thomas, I found them. I found the floorboards. I found your son Caleb. He has your eyes, and he has your heart. I promise you, the cold is finally leaving this house. You aren't a ghost anymore, son. You're the reason the truth is finally coming home. I'm sorry I was blind for so long, but I'm awake now, and I'm not stopping until every single person who hurt you is held to account. Cut, Elena whispered. She was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Caleb was standing by the bookshelf, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. The silence that followed was different than the silence of my bedroom. This was the silence of a fuse that had just been lit. We have the video, Elena said. Her voice regained its professional edge. I'll edit it into the presentation. We'll intercut your message with the bank transfers, the shipping manifests, and the photos of the tampered oxygen tank. By the time the governor gets up to give them their award, the entire ballroom will be looking at a map of a criminal empire. But we have to move. Security will be tight. They have security for the guests, I said. But they don't notice the people who make the party happen. The waiters, the tech crew, the janitors. To a Sterling, those people are invisible. We're going to use that arrogance against them. Caleb, you're going to be part of the catering staff. Elena, you're the freelance photographer, hired to cover the event. And well, I'm the distraught old man who's going to provide the distraction. It's too dangerous for you, Silas. Caleb said, stepping forward. Raid told Julianne he'd finish what he started if he found you. If he sees you in that hotel, he won't wait for a wellness check. He'll kill you. He already tried to kill me in my soul 4 years ago, I replied. I'm 70 years old, Caleb. I've lived a full life. You have yours ahead of you. This isn't about my safety. This is about Thomas's legacy. I'm the only one who can get close enough to Julianne to keep her busy while Alina hooks into the system. She thinks I'm weak. She thinks I'm a broken old man who's lost his mind. I'm going to let her believe that for just 5 more minutes. The plan was a tapestry of moving parts. We spent the rest of the night practicing the timing. We had the layout of the grand hotel ballroom. We knew exactly where the tech booth was located and which service elevator led to the kitchen. Every detail was checked and rechecked. I used my library's database to find the name of the catering company and the specific uniforms they wore. We were no longer just a librarian and a journalist. We were a tactical unit. There's one more thing, I said as the first light of morning began to filter through the basement windows. The sterling bribes. We need to make sure the police who show up aren't the ones on the payroll. Elena, do you have a contact in the state police? I do, she said. The head of the Internal Affairs Division has been looking for a reason to investigate the local sheriff for years. If I tell him I have a streamed confession involving state-level bribery, he'll have a SWAT team there in 20 minutes. They'll be coming from the capital, far outside the Sterling's reach. Good, I said. I stood up, my joints popping, but my back felt straighter than it had in years. I looked at the table of evidence, the result of a night of tireless investigation. We had turned the Sterling bribes into a noose. We had transformed Thomas's dead man's switch into a living weapon. Go get some sleep, I told them. We have a long day ahead of us, Caleb. Keep that journal close. It's the only thing that matters if anything happens to me. Nothing is going to happen to you, Grandpa, Caleb said, his voice firm. We're finishing this together. I watched them leave, their footsteps echoing on the stairs. I stayed in the basement for a few minutes longer, sitting in the dark. I thought about the Sterlings in their mansion, probably waking up and preparing for their night of glory. They had no idea that the invisible people they looked down upon were already moving against them. They had no idea that a 70-year-old librarian was about to give the most important presentation of his career. I picked up the cream-colored invitation one last time. I tore it in half and dropped it into the trash can. The Sterling brand was built on a foundation of lies, and tonight, I was going to pull the rug out from under it. I'm coming for you, Julianne, I whispered to the empty room. And I'm bringing the truth with me. The Grand Hotel ballroom was a sea of velvet and diamonds. I stood near the back, my old black suit feeling like a costume. Around me, the elite of the state sipped champagne that cost more than a month of my son's salary. They laughed and chatted, completely unaware that the foundation of their fancy evening was rotting away. I saw Caleb across the room, wearing a waiter's vest, moving with a grace that reminded me so much of Thomas. He caught my eye for a split second and nodded. The trap was set. Elena was already in the tech booth, her laptop connected to the main server. Julianne walked onto the stage. She looked radiant, her dress shimmering under the spotlights. She took the microphone and smiled, the picture of a grieving but strong leader. Welcome, friends, she began. Tonight we celebrate 10 years of the Sterling Foundation. We celebrate the lives we've touched and the healing we've brought to our community. Her voice was like honey, smooth and thick, coating the lies she told with a layer of sweetness. I moved toward the front of the room. I let my shoulders slump and my hands shake. To anyone watching, I was just a confused, grieving father who had wandered into the wrong party. Julianne saw me. Her smile faltered for a heartbeat before she recovered. She signaled to Raid, who was standing in the wings, his face darkening with rage. He started moving toward me, but I didn't stop. I needed to reach the stage before the slideshow began. And now, Julianne continued, her voice gaining strength. Let's look at some of our proudest moments from the past year. She signaled for the lights to dim. The massive screen behind her flickered. The crowd hushed, expecting photos of children in brand new hospital wings. Instead, the ballroom was filled with a sharp, static-filled sound. It was the 3:47 a.m. voice note. Thomas's voice echoed off the high ceilings, raw and terrified. Dad, if you're hearing this, I'm already gone. They're going to call it an accident. Don't believe them. I know the truth now, and they know I know. It's the corrupt payments, Dad. They're killing people for profit. The room went dead silent. Julianne froze, her hand still raised toward the screen. The first slide appeared. It wasn't a hospital. It was a photo of the original ledger. Thomas's handwriting clear and undeniable. Beside it was a photo of a sick child from the East Side Clinic, followed by a copy of a bank transfer to an inspector. The contrast was devastating. On one side of the ballroom were people in $5,000 tuxedos. On the screen were the gray, tired faces of parents who couldn't afford the medicine the Sterlings had diluted for profit. The phrase, inventory optimization, appeared in giant red letters over a shipping manifest that proved the company knew the drugs were useless. It was a visual map of a criminal empire. Across the bottom of the screen, a live social media feed began to scroll. The truth ticker. Comments from the thousands of people watching Alina's live stream started pouring in. I worked at that warehouse! We were told not to look at the lot numbers. And my sister died from that batch. Justice for Thomas. And the Sterlings are monsters. The collective roar of the public was now a physical presence in the room. Shut it down. Raid roared from the side of the room. He lunged toward the tech booth, but the doors were locked from the inside. Elena had planned for this. I stepped into the light at the foot of the stage. Julianne looked down at me, her face pale, the mask of the grieving fiancé completely shattered. What have you done, Silas? She hissed, her voice barely audible over the gasps of the crowd. I'm just a librarian, Julianne, I said, my voice carrying through the silent hall. I'm just returning a very overdue book. Thomas's book. More photos flashed on the screen. The tampered oxygen tank. The filed down regulator. A photo of the cabin floorboards pried open. The social commentary was written in every shocked face in the audience. These people had come to celebrate a hero, but they were staring at a murderer. The governor, sitting in the front row, stood up and walked out, his face a mask of fury. Others followed. The Sterling brand was evaporating in real time. The very people they had bribed were now terrified to be associated with them. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a public execution of a lie. This is a lie! Julianne screamed at the audience, her voice cracking. This is the work of a senile old man who can't accept his son's accident. He's unstable. Security, remove him. But the screen showed Thomas's final journal entry now. A close-up of the words, I'm going to the lake today. Raid insisted we go diving to clear the air, before the wedding. He's acting like everything is fine, but he's too friendly. I don't trust it. Raid finally reached the stage, his eyes wild. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. You're coming with me, old man, he growled. He tried to pull me toward the side exit, but I planted my feet. I wasn't the weak victim he remembered from 4 years ago. I was fueled by every word I had read in that basement. No, I said, looking him in the eye. I'm right where I need to be. Everyone is watching, Raid. The truth doesn't drown. It just waits for the ice to melt. And your merger ends tonight. I looked at the donors. Some were crying. Some were filming with their phones. The blood money that bought this gala couldn't buy silence anymore. The moral reckoning had arrived. I felt a strange sense of peace. The cold that had haunted me for 4 years was finally starting to lift. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the witness, and the world was finally listening to the voice of Thomas Vance. He had spoken from beyond the grave, and the walls of the Sterling mansion were beginning to tumble down around them. The elite gathered here had spent the night patting themselves on the back for their charity, but now they were forced to look at the bodies buried under their fortunes. Every crystal glass on the tables seemed to vibrate with the power of the revelation. This was my victory. Reed's fingers dug into my shoulder like iron talons, his face inches from mine. You're done, Silas, he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and desperation. The ballroom was a blur of shimmering fabric and shocked faces. Security was finally pushing through the heavy double doors, but they weren't the ones I was waiting for. Julianne pushed her way past the podium, her silk dress reflecting the blue light of the laptop screen that still displayed the evidence of her crimes. She looked like a cornered animal, despite the millions of dollars in jewelry around her neck. Her eyes were wide, scanning the room for a way to stop the bleeding. "Raid, let him go," she commanded. Her voice was sharp, a desperate attempt to regain control of the room. Raid hesitated, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull away. I stood my ground on the stage, the center of a storm I had spent 4 years preparing for. The guests were mostly silent now, their phones held high like tiny torches, recording every second of the Sterling family's downfall. The air in the ballroom felt electric, heavy with the weight of a decade of secrets finally coming to light. Julianne stepped closer to me, her eyes darting to the cameras and then back to my face. She lowered her voice, trying to project an image of a concerned family member to anyone watching from a distance. "Silas, please. You're not well. This grief has twisted your mind. We can talk about this privately. We can help you." She paused, a flicker of her old manipulative self returning. "Think about Thomas's name. We can fix this. We'll build it. A Thomas Vance Memorial Library, the biggest in the state. We'll put his name in granite. You can run it, Silas. You can spend the rest of your life surrounded by his memory. Just tell them this was all a misunderstanding. Tell them the files are fake. We can make all this go away with a single statement." I looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Even now, with the truth screaming from the rafters, she thought she could buy my son's legacy. She thought she could entice a librarian with a building named after the man she helped kill. It was the ultimate insult. She didn't want to honor him, she wanted to brand him. "You want to put his name on a building?" I asked, my voice booming through the ballroom speakers. I knew Alina was still holding the audio feed open. "You want to use his name to hide the fact that you poisoned children?" "My son doesn't need a library built with blood money, Julianne. He needs the truth." "Silas, be reasonable," Raid growled, stepping toward me again, his fists clenched. "You're an old man with nothing. We're offering you a legacy. Take it before I lose my patience. You're playing a game you can't win. That merger is signed at midnight, and once it is, you're just a footnote." I pulled my own phone from my pocket and held it up for the room to see. "It's 11:45 p.m. Raid, and the world isn't waiting for your merger. They're waiting for your arrest." "What are you talking about?" Julianne asked, her face turning a ghostly shade of white. "The live stream," I said. "There are currently over 80,000 people watching this. The Internal Affairs Division of the State Police has been watching for the last 20 minutes. They've seen the ledger. They've heard Thomas's voice. And they just heard you try to buy my silence with a library." Julianne's knees buckled. She looked at the tech booth, but the screen was now showing a live comment feed from the news site. Thousands of messages were scrolling past, people calling for justice, parents sharing photos of their sick children, people demanding the Sterlings be taken away in chains. The wall of silence they had built with their wealth had been shattered. "You can't do this," Raid snarled. He lunged for me, his hands reaching for my throat. I braced myself, but before he could reach me, a figure stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the stage. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face that stopped Raid in his tracks. Caleb stepped into the spotlight, the blue light of the screen catching the sharp line of his jaw and the deep blue of his eyes. He looked exactly like Thomas did the last year. He was alive. The same height, the same hair, the same defiant gaze. It was as if the lake had given back what it had taken. Reed stumbled back, his eyes bulging. "Thomas," he whispered, his voice cracking with a primal bone-deep fear. He fell over a chair, scrambling away on the floor as if he were seeing a vengeful spirit. "No," Caleb said, his voice deep and steady. "But I'm his son, and I'm the one you couldn't pay to disappear. I'm the truth you tried to bury." The shock in the room was a physical force. Julianne let out a strangled cry and fell back against the podium. The guests were gasping. some standing on chairs to get a better look at the boy who looked like a ghost. Caleb stood next to me, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder. We were a united front, the past and the future coming together to demand a final reckoning. You thought you could just delete him, Caleb said, looking down at Julianne. You thought you could pay my mother to stay silent and kill my father to keep your secrets. But you forgot one thing. You can't kill a legacy, and you definitely can't bribe the truth. The sirens began to wail outside the hotel. The sound grew louder, echoing through the city streets. The heavy ballroom doors were thrown open, and a team of men in dark jackets swarmed into the room. They were state police, led by the internal affairs officers Alina had contacted. They moved with purpose, ignoring the wealthy donors and heading straight for the stage. Raid tried to run for the service exit, but he was tackled to the ground. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was a sharp, satisfying punctuation to the night. Julianne stood frozen, her hands trembling as a female officer approached her. Julianne Sterling, you're under arrest for corporate fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder, the officer said. Julianne looked at me one last time. There was no sweetness left, no silk, no grace. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness. She realized that everything she had worked for was gone. Her name was ruined, her fortune was forfeit, and the merger was dead. I stepped forward, looking her right in the eyes. You buried my son in the cold water, Julianne. You thought your money would keep him down forever. But you were wrong. The truth doesn't drown, it just waits for the ice to melt. They led her away, her head bowed as the cameras flashed. The elite guests were now scurrying for the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the sterling name. Caleb, Alina, and I stayed on the stage as the room emptied. We did it, Grandpa, Caleb whispered. No, Caleb, I said, looking at the screen where Thomas's face was now frozen in a smile. Thomas did it. We just made sure the world finally heard him. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of justice. The sterling fortune was dismantled with surgical precision. Because the wealth had been proven to be the result of criminal activity, the state seized every asset. The mansion was sold, and the company was liquidated. Every cent was rerouted back into the community. The East Side Clinic received a massive endowment, allowing them to provide free, high-quality medication to every family the Sterlings had harmed. Caleb moved into the carriage house with me. We spent our evenings talking about the man we both loved. I told him stories of Thomas as a boy, and Caleb told me about the secret meetings he'd had with his father before the accident. We were two people who had been robbed of the same life, but in our shared loss, we found a new beginning. Caleb decided to go to college to study law. He wanted to make sure that no other family ever had to wait 4 years for the truth. One Saturday morning, the sun came out with a brilliance I hadn't seen in years. I grabbed my old truck keys and looked at Caleb. I think it's time we went back to the lake, I said. We drove up the mountain in silence. The road didn't feel like a scar anymore, it just felt like a road. We parked at the edge of the water, near the spot where the car had gone down. The lake was still and clear, reflecting the sky. We walked down to the shore, the small waves lapping at our boots. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver whistle. It was Thomas's old scout whistle. I'd kept it on my dresser for years, a silent reminder of the boy who always wanted to lead the way. I handed it to Caleb. Your father would want you to have this, I told him. He always said that if you're lost, you just have to blow the whistle and someone will come to find you. Well, we found him, Caleb. We found the truth. Caleb held the whistle in his palm, his eyes glistening. He saved us, Grandpa. Even after he was gone, he was still taking care of us. He was. I agreed. We stood there for a long time, watching the sunlight dance on the water. I thought about the 3:47 a.m. call. I thought about the floorboards and the wood carving of the owl that Caleb now kept on his desk. The secrets were gone, and the weight was lifted. Thomas was finally resting in peace, his name restored and his son safe. I've learned that justice doesn't always come when you want it to, but it always arrives exactly when it is needed. For 4 years I lived in a cage built of my own grief. But Thomas gave me the key. He reminded me that being a father doesn't end when a life does. It's a job that lasts as long as you have a memory. My story isn't just about revenge. It's about the fact that no matter how much money someone has, they can't buy the truth. The sterling name will be forgotten, but the lives they tried to throw away are still here. We are the witnesses. We are the survivors. And as long as we keep speaking up, the darkness will never win. The sun is high now, and the shadows are short. My name is Silas Vance, and I am finally home. Now, I can finally sleep.